This episode is proudly supported by Anchor Food Professionals, makers of mainland cheese. Here's Andy Sy from the Notting Hill Hotel.
We've been using them for a few years now, using their tasty and mozzarella cheese. We go through about 135 kilos a week at the moment. So a huge number. So we use it for our garlic bread, our pizzas, our parmas, our bechamel, our cheese sauce for our croquettes and arancini, throughout our lasagnas, anywhere we can really. It's such a good product. You know, having the freshest chips to your fresh chicken to a freshly crumbed schnitzel and topping up with a really high quality cheese is amazing.
For more information, go to anchorfoodprofessionals.com.
I'm very visual in terms of I can see a pathway. So I don't take on stuff that I don't see the pathway to achieve it. You have to bring people along with you to help you do that. You can't do it all yourself.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Well, the last time we caught up with today's guests, he shared so many stories, we had to break it into 2 episodes. That doesn't happen very often. Perhaps it's because Ross Lusted always has new things happening and is constantly evolving his life in food. Ross, how are you?
How are you, Hux? Good to see you again, mate.
Mate, it's good to catch you. I can't believe I actually caught you. You're always on a plane somewhere doing something amazing. How are things?
Mate, things are good. It's been a good year. It's been, you sort of get to this time of year, being December, and our daughter's about to finish school, and you reflect over the year. And I know you have 3 kids, and we only have one. When I say only have one, we're really privileged to have one. But with everything that you try and fit in your life, you think, how does life get busier? And then another project comes along and I go, really? And you make your life even busier. But I think that's, it's the, my parents had 3 kids in 3 years, they survived. So, I didn't turn out too bad.
Well, you're always taking on new projects and they're always really exciting and different and challenging. Last time we caught up, you'd opened Woodcut, which has had amazing success since then. And we haven't talked about Marmello, which has also had incredible success in Melbourne. Tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, look, and it's just to go back to your comment then, when you said, we're always taking on new projects. It's interesting. We've had Woodcut. It'll be our 6th year this year. Obviously, we had the Bridge Room for 10 years. But we actually don't take on a lot of projects. We, because it's interesting, like anything, you have to have a real passion in our business. And I think any business, you have to have a real passion for what you do. And then it's what you do say yes to, I think, is more critical. We've been offered, my God, we're privileged to be offered a lot of things, but it's very rare that I feel that we take up we don't take up every offer. But Marmello is a story that I've really wanted to tell for a long time. And like everything, like Woodcut, I think we talked about Woodcut, and Woodcut for me was, finishing up with Aman Resorts, living in the US. I wanted to cook again. I hadn't cooked for 10 years. I wanted to cook again. And we planned to open Woodcut in the US. GFC happened, came back, did Bridge Room, Woodcut. It was always there. It was always percolating in the background. And Marmello has been one of those things for me that's also been in my head for probably 20 years. In a sense that, I'm 5th generation South African. The accent comes back when the rugby is on, especially when we're winning. But most people don't know that. But I am South African, and I've been lucky enough to live in 7 countries, and traveled to pretty much everywhere except the North Pole and the South Pole. And through that journey and cooking, I was struggling a little bit with identity at one point. And what does it mean to be South African? What is our food culture? What is our heritage? What is our history? And a lot of that was obviously there's so many. It's such a melting pot, South Africa. But one of the real constants is the Portuguese. And I sort of started researching, thinking about it, and then I'm like, I remember the Portuguese were in Dubrovnik when we lived in Croatia, and they would buy timber or get timber from Montenegro, and rake the salt from Ston, which was just north. It's about a 2.5 hour drive north of Dubrovnik. One of the first salt producers. I think we talked about this last time. Salt and cod being the first two currencies of the world, and then you start looking at Africa, and so Marmello it's a restaurant that tells the story of the journey of the Portuguese, good, bad, and indifferent. And really its footprint that it's left on the world in terms of food culture. So if you imagine a Portuguese trader or Portuguese explorer, they're leaving Lisbon, they're going via the African coast, Algeria, going down around the sort of the Cape, and the Portuguese left these marking stones of how far they'd gone. So for their future explorers or traders, they could sort of navigate to these stones, which still exist today. And I find it absolutely extraordinary that you can speak to people in Mogadishu that relate to the Portuguese. I was reading an article the other day about Hokkaido, and how Hokkaido had an indigenous community that lived on Hokkaido, and the Japanese had always tried to conquer Hokkaido. And it was only when the Portuguese gave them muskets that they were able to conquer Hokkaido. So, I mean, the footprint of the Portuguese is everywhere. And I worked in India and in Asia, and former Batavia, which is now Malaysia and Indonesia. The Portuguese were there. You look at Peranakan food, Nonya food. You go up to Macau, Macanese food. Portuguese tarts. When you're eating in Macau, it's just a thing. You have Portuguese tarts, and I'm not saying this for everyone, but I think someone mentioned the other day to me, that's why we have custard tarts in Chinese restaurants at Yamcha. And I'm like, no, it's not. I said that the custard tarts that are in Yamcha are from the British. I think it was the governor of Hong Kong's wife wanted these custard tarts, and sort of harking back to her days in England, and they didn't really know how to do it, so they got the dumpling chef who was making savory pastry tarts with lard, and sort of when you think about that, why do we have an English style custard tart at the end of Yamcha? And then when you just go across into Macau, it's a completely different egg tart, and I don't know if you know feuilleton. You know feuilleton? It's like we used to make it at Darley Street Thai. It's duck egg yolks that are whisked up, strained, and then in a big brass wok, you make a very thick sugar syrup with pandan leaves. And then the Thais have this a really sharp angled cone with 2 holes in the bottom. And what you do is you put the egg yolks into the cone, and you swirl it around into the sugar syrup. And it makes these fine egg threads. And you can go to China, like if you go down to Thai Town and Campbell Street, you can buy feuilleton. It's candied egg yolk threads. And they make another thing, met kanom, and all these different Thai desserts are really focused around egg yolks. And that is from the Portuguese. So, and when I was in Lisbon, and I'm in this cake shop, and there's this Thai egg threads on top of a dessert. And I'm like, okay, my brain is exploding now. Like, how does that work? And this is the history of food, the cross-pollination of so many cultures experience centuries of trade, spice trade, and why is when you cross the border from Spain into the Algarve and you're still on the same coast of the what is that sea? Mediterranean. The food changes. you go from parsley and garlic with clams and white wine to coriander seed, garlic and white wine with clams. Coriander sort of separates the border, which I find absolutely extraordinary. Yeah. So it's been a journey of we didn't want to do like it's not what we do anyway, but we're never going to do a themed restaurant. So Mitchell and Eads, who are architects, and I have a lot of time for Sam, and they have an amazing firm in Melbourne. And so again, probably for the listeners, if you look at what we do from the bridge room to Woodcut to now Marmello, there is no thread. The only thread is my view on food. And we love working with architects. I'm very passionate about design and curating the experience as opposed to a themed experience. But I find that extremely exciting. I travel a lot, which I'm very lucky to be able to do. But I think it's a collection of ideas, and it is really showcasing the journey of the Portuguese. And through that story, it highlights how far they went. And the fact that we have an octopus curry from Goa on the menu, and one of our team is actually from Goa in Melbourne, and I was sort of explaining my time in India and working. I mean, she brought it to tears. She's telling her mum that I'm working in this restaurant in Melbourne and they have a Goan curry, and then I had to get corrected by her to say, like, please tell me, are we on the right track? Because these things they are also emotive for people. So you want to make sure that the Portuguese community have embraced it in Melbourne. Melbournians have embraced it. A lot of people said to me, "Are you nuts?" No chefs. There's very few chefs. I think you count on one hand. That have gone to Melbourne and have opened restaurants down there, and I never really looked at that, and I probably don't. I don't consider it as should I, shouldn't I? We had an idea, and Melbourne's the perfect city. Melbourne is a very market centric city. South Melbourne Market, Queen Vic, Fitzroy Market. Like, there's so many, and people are they shop, they use the markets. I wish we had that in Sydney. This localized market. We have Everleigh Markets, which is fantastic. We have the Paddington Markets only on Saturdays now, but the idea that I'd take the 96 tram from Russell Street and I'd go to South Melbourne Market probably 3 times a week, because it's just it's part of the community. And for me as a chef, you're always inspired by a market. It doesn't matter if you're eating, and you can have, Slavic burek in the market, or you can have Vietnamese noodles, or there's amazing family that make dumplings, or you can have, a dozen oysters and some prawns. Like, I mean, that, how more Australian can you get in terms of, and I don't think there's a sausage sizzle in sight, which is, I'm not saying sausage sizzles are bad. There's a place for mystery meat in a bread roll, but, the idea that we are truly, I look at it and I stand and I love it, because I've lived in monocultural countries. You wake up in the morning in Dubrovnik and you go to the market, which I used to do again 3 times a week. And for us, it was about a 20-minute drive in the winter, and it's something you wouldn't probably even contemplate in the summer, because it takes you 2 hours to get from Suftat to Dubrovnik in the summer because of the traffic. So we had a little localized market, and but we would pick caper leaves and pick the flowers and pickle them, and because there is this true seasonality there, where there are no vegetables in the winter, and if you don't preserve or you don't have a small greenhouse or something, you struggle. So Marmello for me is really it's a Melbourne restaurant. It's a restaurant that sits perfectly in that environment, and it's within the Hyatt Hotel, and which is great because it's, again, I love hotels. I'm a hotelier at heart, and I love the link of accommodation and what what that facilitates in a guest experience. And, we're probably one of the only, I wouldn't say one of the only countries, but one of the countries that doesn't really embrace the idea of hotels and hotel restaurants and like the rest of the world does. And, in saying that, I opened a restaurant, Harbour Kitchen, a bar in Park Heights, Sydney, probably before you were born, Hucks.
That's right. Come on, mate. I thought we were the same age.
But, you look at Harbour Kitchen and Bar, and that was, a fantastic restaurant right on Sydney Harbour. And we're going to see the Waldorf Astoria open soon, which is amazing again. So, hotels make up a big part of the fabric of our environment. 25 hours, I live in Paddington, 25 hours has just opened up the road and doing great things. And for us as a community, I'm like, fantastic. I caught up with a mate of mine in the bar and we were having a drink there. He was from Melbourne. He's like, this is so cool. And then, a mate of mine who's a chef, he walked in, parked his Vespa out the front, walked in and was like, what are you guys doing here? Chat. And there's your night. So they create community as well. And so in Marmello, it's also Mr. Mills. Mr. Mills there was a printing company, Mills & Co., that were in that building. So we called the bar downstairs Mr. Mills. So that, again, is completely different, same architects, but different interior design, something much more. I like the idea of, I'm rambling a bit here, but when we first looked at the site, there was a builder's void in the middle of this tenancy, right? Because they had to crane all the materials downstairs. And once you'd sort of seen that void, it was taking all the light down to the bottom. And I'm like, how could you separate these? It'd be like separating twins at birth, So it was like, we have to do something with that. And so we have this sort of beautiful staircase that connects the two sites. But it's the idea that you can have a drink before dinner, you can, and in a time of restaurants where, it's been a hard year. People turn tables and, you've got to be gone by 8. And in the hospitality business, that's really hard to tell someone, hey, by the way, we're just going to end your night on here's the bill, see you later. So what it does, it allows us to take people downstairs, have another drink or, continue their conversation, which I think is hospitality. So it's a very expensive hospitality offer, but
it's a lovely perspective to have to continue their conversation and that sort of approach.
Yeah, look, and I think that, I totally understand the idea that you have to turn tables. We do it in our business. And how many times have you been to a restaurant saying, is there any chance we can continue? And, in Melbourne, to walk another 500 meters to find another venue in the winter could be horrendous, So the idea that we can keep people in the building and also then offer another venue for the hotel is great. So,
well, how do you translate this giant message into a menu? Like, was it challenging creating the menu? And are there a couple of dishes you can sort of tell us about that kind of explain what you're doing there?
Yeah, look, I'd been to Portugal a lot. As I said, we lived in Dubrovnik. So when you live in Europe, thank Christ for things like a Ryanair or EasyJet or whatever. You can fly somewhere in an hour and be in Barcelona. And so the sort of conceptualizing the menu, there's too much. There's actually too much. There's from the south, from the Algarve all the way up to Cantabria on the Basque sort of countryside where they harvest all the sardine anchovies. It's extraordinary, and then if you get into the wine, the fortified wines, port has been made for centuries in Porto, and so it wasn't. I couldn't go. This is going to be a traditional Portuguese restaurants with the greatest hits, because I don't. It didn't really interest me in a sense that it was really the journey And the footprint. So we'll have dishes where green coriander seeds are very much part. Where they're pickled, or so raw fish. The anchovies, we started with the anchovies, and when you go there, and in February is the harvest of the anchovies. It's the time of year in Cantabria, and anchovies used to be. I don't know if you know this fun fact, but anchovies were stored in clarified butter, not oil. And then as the production of oil became more mechanized and cheaper, anchovies started to be stored in oil. So there's still a couple of families that do anchovies stored in butter, clarified butter, and you just warm them up, and then you sit there with a piece of bread and these anchovies. I mean, it's like,
that sounds like heaven.
Like I can see you're salivating already, and
I haven't had breakfast yet. That was cruel.
So it's one of those things. So I was like, okay, we've got to get those anchovies, and they got stuck in customs, and we lost a lot of anchovies. But when we opened the restaurant, or when I was thinking about it, I'm like, this is there with caviar, these anchovies, and for me, we sort of opened the restaurant with this tongue-in-cheek saying, is this the new caviar? And I think it has equal footing. It's one of those most extraordinary things that when you think of someone takes this tiny fish, it's in a season, they harvest it, and then they clean it by hand and they process it, and they don't ship it all over the world. It's almost like on allocation to get these anchovies. And if you've been to somewhere in Spain or Portugal, where there's a place, Quime in Barcelona, and everything is from a tin, and it's standing room only. They serve a carver, and there's one chef. It's almost like a sushi chef behind the counter, for want of a better word. Definitely for the people who've been there, don't quote me on that. It's not, but there's this one guy behind the counter, and he just makes tapa, and but behind that are all the tins stacked up behind him, and you can pay 50, 60 euros for 4 anchovies, and it's only when you eat them, they're the length of your hand. They're so fat, they're so juicy. So is that people talk about paying a fortune for caviar. Like this for me is the same. So we heroed the anchovy at Woodcut. We silver serve it. At Marmello there, and I think that for me, that sort of sets the tone for what we're doing there. And then there's obviously charcoal, wood ovens, cast iron skillets. It's that. The type of food that I cook, that it's the requirement. And then there's dishes like assorta, which assorta is there's people in Portugal that couldn't afford rice. Portugal was one of the poorest countries in Europe up until actually recently, and they would take dried bread and they would add it to a fish stew. And it's funny because, small fish and clams and all that is available. It's a premium product in most countries, whereas they've got plenty of seafood, and but they need the staples: beans, rice, bread. So dried bread would be added into this fish stew, and it's just extraordinary, and I think again. That's one of the dishes we have on the menu now. Now, assorta is generally, it's a huge pot that's put in the middle of the table and the whole family dines on it. I wouldn't say refined it. We put it into a restaurant context, but it still has those flavors. And, Portugal is, what I wrote this down the other day. I was doing some more research. I'm trying to find it. They call it the land of eggs, and it truly is. Like, and again, you don't. They prize the hens, and the roosters are generally the ones that go in the pot because, the hens keep on getting. You only need one rooster, right? And so so in terms of the land of eggs, there's just so many dishes, and we do a sweetbreads with peas and some red wine vinegar, and it has a deep fried egg on it because that's what. And the chefs are saying. So they're getting out when we were doing the pre-opening training and that, and they're getting out these non-stick pans to do the fried eggs. I'm like, no, you need a pot of oil, and you're cracking the egg into the oil and it just goes everywhere. And you got to have really good eggs so they don't explode. Not too much, not water in them. And so those are the things for me that I don't know how to explain it, but I find it so exciting. A deep fried egg is putting a deep fried egg on top of sweetbreads in a restaurant in Melbourne. And and when I worked for Tomo at Darley Street, it was the same thing. We were doing the son-in-law eggs, which is boiled eggs, is like you're deep frying if you misbehave. And I thought we were going to do boiled eggs deep fried, and Tomo's like, no, we just crack the eggs into a wok. And I think I still have scars on my arms from frying eggs, but it's funny how something almost 20 years later comes around again. And we do a steak in the bar with a deep fried egg on top of it and anchovies. I mean, it's so good. But so it is the land of eggs. So eggs feature, and I'm a bit of a research geek, so I was looking, dessert wise, and it's very limited because not limited in the sense that there's a lot of tradition around it, and there's things like obviously. Well, not obviously, I should explain this, but the restaurant is called Marmello because that's quince in Portuguese. And so quince features very heavily in the season, and for no reason except I was walking through a market in outside of Lisbon, and they just had quince and a sign stuck in it that said Marmello, and I can't remember the price, but even the font of the way someone had written the Marmello is actually became the sort of anchor for the identity. When I was talking to Nick from Projects of Imagination, phenomenal identity guys in Melbourne, and I said to Nick, he's like, what about the name? I said, it's Marmello. It just is Marmello. It's not. And then, Nick did this amazing sort of graphics around the storytelling of Portugal. And there is so much of that. And we have ravens on the menu. And sorry, we don't cook ravens, but the logo of these ravens. Ravens are the protector of the port of Lisbon. So two big ravens at the entry of the port. And Melbourne doesn't have crows; it has ravens. So again, it's this weird thing that there's ravens in Melbourne, and so I really am rambling, but so we're getting back to the dessert part. So, we had quince, and there's a way to cook quince that keeps it white, doesn't go pink. So we do this in the season. We do this white and red quince, served with sort of the syrup and olive oil. But also there's another dessert that I'd read about, and it was hard to find in Lisbon, but it's a dessert that was made in a monastery in Lisbon, and it was a monk, and they used to use the egg whites to starch the papal cloth. So they had a lot of egg yolks left over. And so for the parishioners, he made this dessert. And because there's not a lot of dairy in terms of cream, they use pork fat as an alternative. So we have this dessert, which is it's like if you imagine a creme caramel, for argument's sake, and it has this port caramel on the bottom, and then you make the custard with sugar, egg yolks, and pork fat, and then you bake it, and it's like you don't taste pork at all, and it's almost like this translucent because it doesn't have the density of cream because pork fat's clear. So again, one of those desserts that I thought we've got to do this, and so it's called Pudim, Pudim, and so I'm like, all right, and Sunny said to me, she's like, there's just no way people are going to eat pork fat for dessert, and I'm like, that's why I do what I do, but you got to throw it out there, and So again, we tell the story of it, and we've got a great team down there, and the team tell the story. And once you hear the story, it's very hard not to try it. And so I like, I'm a storyteller. I feel that I've been lucky enough to do things. So to take people on that journey and experience it, it's a lot of fun. Yeah.
Not only are you balancing restaurant in Sydney and one in Melbourne as well, you're heavily involved with Qatar Airlines too. So tell us about that gig and how did that come about and what are you doing?
So, like I said, I travel a lot and I've always been, I worked with Neil Perry actually on his original launch for Qantas when I was at Rockville a long time ago. And so I like the airline business. I think it's interesting. It's like the hotel business. I just find it fascinating that, I was at a facility in Doha and they produce 250,000 meals a day, and you look at that and you think, my God, how do you possibly do quality when you're doing that much? Well, they have 5,000 staff, and we had lunch in the staff canteen because we're going to prepare something. I said, I'd just love to go and eat in the staff canteen and see what and they had Arabic food, they had Indian food, and then, full vegetarian, everything's halal. But it was just fascinating to see that they're also not only producing 250,000 meals a day in Doha, they're also feeding 5,000 staff a day, so it's interesting. Qatar Airways approached me, and I was surprised. I was taken back. And I said, I understand the interest and so forth, but why? And they said that they felt Woodcut was a quintessential Australian restaurant. And I said, okay. So I looked at that and they said, yeah, from cold seafood to meat cooked over charcoal. It's about produce. It's produce driven. It's an open restaurant. You can talk to chefs, so that's hospitality. I think that's the Australian culture. We talk to people. We travelled where it's on Sydney Harbour. So I think from Qatar's perspective, they like the idea that Woodcut was this vehicle that was relatable to customers. And I mean, we do 2,500 customers a week through Woodcut, so it's a busy restaurant. So there is I always said, we're preaching to the converted, people flying out of Sydney, but then it's Melbourne, it's Perth, it's Adelaide, it's Brisbane, so it's all over. But what was great was knowing how the airline business works. We sat down with a couple of development chefs and we said, okay, let's look at the ideas of what is Woodcut, what can we put on an aircraft that represents what we do. We can't grill a steak in air on board. I'm trying. I think we might get there, maybe barbecue out the back one day, but at the end of the day, we have to be appropriate. And I think it's also having traveled a lot. And when I worked for Aman Resorts, I was 9 months of the year I was on the road. And as a customer getting on an aircraft, it's like, what time are you leaving? You know, when I went to Doha last week, I left. I think my flight was 10:40 at night. So all you want to do is get on the plane and sleep. You've already had dinner. You know, I don't drink when I travel, fly. So you know what you might have a beer in the airport. You probably would have eaten. So you want to get on, and if you're flying at the pointy end, you get to lie down and prepare yourself for when you land. Because the reason I think they call it business class is because you're going for work, you know, and you land. And I think I landed at 4:20 in the morning, and my first meeting was 8. You know, I don't even know what time zone I was on. I had a shower, and you know, I actually went for a swim. I dived in the pool and try to acclimatize, and then go, right, where am I? Doha, let's go. You know, and I think for most people, that's how it is for travel. Apart, you know, if you're on holidays, it's great. And my daughter did ask me, you know, Daddy, how many packets of Pringles is it okay for me to order? Yeah. I'm like, it was her first time flying at the pointy end, so she was very excited about that. But I think it's understanding the customer, developing dishes that are appropriate for the time that you're actually flying. And you know, I worked for Adrian Zecker at Aman Resorts for 12 years. And, you know, Adrian said to me, it doesn't matter what we put on the menus in the hotels. It's if we can't get the orange juice, the coffee, and the croissant right, if we can't get those 3 things right, actually, you like to eat a bit of a secret love of ice cream, say it's in the ice cream as well. You know, if you can't get those 4 things right, give up. Forget it. So I think that I've applied that in my career, is like, if we can't get the basics right, who we're kidding. So let's look at those things and try to make people's experience. And what I do like about Qatar is from the booking process. This is not an infomercial for them, don't get me wrong, but you know, there's from the check-in process to the, you know, the service on board and all that. I mean, it is extremely good. And hence they've won all the awards. But I think that's it. Yeah, Qatar for me it's about you can't go in there and change an industry that flies millions of people around the world on an hourly basis. You just need to put on something that's appropriate to what the time of day that people are getting on the aircraft, and also you've got them for 14 hours. And part of that experience is food. The rest is entertainment or comfort or quality of air and all those sorts of things. And you know, we live very far from everyone else in the world. So for us, that idea of your first stop is 14 hours, I think you owe it to a passenger if they choose to fly with your airline to provide the best possible ingredients, service, experience that you can. And that's why, you know, I'm very happy to work with them, because I can contribute to something that is already extraordinary product. So
can you give us a glimpse into creating a dish and maybe using an example? Because there's always this talk about how our taste buds act differently up in the air and how recipes need to be different to what they are on the ground. Is that true? Is there sort of a trial and error in that?
Yeah, look, 20 years ago, we were testing food in simulators, pressurized simulators. Today, aircrafts are so completely different. You know, I flew on the 380 coming back, and my God, I was just remembering, you know, some of the horrendous flights I've had, and it's so quiet. You know, the air is really clean. It's quite, you know, it's quite dry. It's not humid, but it's a controlled environment. So getting to answer your question, no, I don't think you have to modify. You know, we used to make things a bit more salty or punchy. You know, like I think one of the worst things I've ever eaten on an airline is a lamb cutlet, and I think that's what, you know, take take lamb neck. The first menu cycle we did was also buco made with lamb shanks, and that has been one of the most successful dishes that they've ever seen on Qatar Airlines in terms of feedback. And I'm like, okay, well, who doesn't want to eat freaking, we had a cured fish plate and the lamb shanks and a bus cheesecake, which is a version of our cheesecake that we do in Marmello. And they're like, well, how do we change what's going to be next, because these are prove extremely successful. And I'm not saying that because it's the food that I did, but I think that comfort food, that level of, a braise, and we were talking about this literally last week in Doha, and again, it's something that there is nostalgia, I think, and nostalgia is one of the things that I think we don't think about it enough in restaurants. And when we opened Woodcut, actually, even when we opened Bridge Room and we were cooking over, I don't want to say I was the first, but we were one of the first restaurants at that level that had a charcoal grill where there was a lot of sous vide and finishing in pans, lots of butter and yada yada. And we were cooking over charcoal, no sous vide. And the idea that people would say, oh my God, this reminds me of lamb my dad used to cook in the backyard on the barbecue, and that's something for me that was my heritage, growing up in South Africa, 44-gallon drum cut in half. And I think my mum was in her 40s when she realized that it didn't take 3 hours to get the barbecue ready, because my uncles and my dad were there like, darling, it's going to be at least another half an hour. And the idea that, it was a lot of bullshit talked around a barbecue. And again, when we opened Woodcut and people could see cooking, a piece of meat that hasn't been sous vide or prepared in another way, just on the charcoal. And there is food memories, and we all have food memories. And even you might not know you have it until you taste it and you go, oh, that just takes me back. And I love seeing people in Woodcut go through that. And I would imagine that someone eating lamb shanks at 30,000 feet is going, holy shit, like that's Sunday dinner that someone has spent, 3 hours slowly braising those and cutting the vegetables really fine. And, I think those are the things that take people or create a food memory for them. And if we can do that, I mean, happy days.
You taking on three huge things at a very high level and excelling at it. What sort of advice would you have for someone out there, to take on so many different projects and keep the identity of each one as it is and be so successful at it?
I've been practicing this for a long time, Hucks. You can see one of my little sculptures in the background there. I make sculpture, and I spend a lot of time drawing, making my sculptures, and I am going to have that exhibition soon. But that's my vehicle. That's my way of creating the creativeness, if that's even a word. But I have to do something else that inspires me to do what I love doing. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely love what I'm doing every day, but I can't. It can't be my only thing. And I think a lot of my success is I am a chef, but I'm not only a chef. I worked in hotel development. I was a hotelier. I studied fine art. I like building stuff. So I don't identify as that. I go to work to be a chef. I go to work to inspire people, to employ people. I mean, we have almost 300 people that work for us now. And the fact that 300 people get out of bed in the morning, brush their teeth, comb their hair, and come to work for Sunny and I is a huge responsibility. to start with. But ultimately, we're providing employment, careers, career development, inspiration. I would hope to think that there's a generation of people who've worked for us over the years that go, you know what, that that was his way of doing it, but I have my way of doing it, and you can't copy me because you can't be me. But what you can do is learn from the journey. And I think my takeaway to answer your question is I think you need more than just your work. Your work is your work. I don't see it as work. Maybe I'm a workaholic, but I don't see that is my work and this is my life. I don't come home on a Friday afternoon, open a beer and go, oh my God, I'm going to go and play golf or go and do something today because I hate my job. And I used to do a talk for Macquarie Bank, and it was about that. And the first question I'd ask is, ask people in a room full of bankers. They've talked. It was we used to do it for Penfolds. We'd do a dinner and then do very salubrious, Grange tasting, and so then they'd ask me to talk about my travels and a little bit of what we're doing now. But the first thing I'd ask people who loves their job, and all these people would put their hands up, of course they are. And we get to the end of it and I'd say, yes, I stopped cooking because I wasn't passionate about it anymore. I'd worked for Neil Perry. I've told you the story, but I worked for Neil. I worked for David Thompson. I opened a huge restaurant in Singapore for Hyatt, extremely successful. But it's like, well, what am I about? And I didn't have the hook. I didn't have the thing that said to me, this is what you are. This is your identity. Every time I'd cook something, it would be a version of Neil's dish or something I'd seen in a cookbook or something I would, remember as an apprentice or something. But you just go like, what am I? What is my contribution? And I always view it as a contribution. So I stopped cooking for 10 years. And I loved working for Aman Resorts. I love art and architecture, so I got into hotel development. No one really knew that I was a cook. Even Adrian Zaka said to me one day, we were flying back from New York and we were doing a project in Utah, and 3 architects wanted to do the project together. And Adrian said to me, we were flying back, and he goes, you're a cook, aren't you? I said, yes, Adrian. He goes, 3 cooks, 1 kitchen. How would that work? And I said, yeah, that's not going to work. And it sort of reminded me at the time, yeah, I did have another profession before I started working. And I honestly thought, I would really not cook again. I was quite happy not to cook again. And then, after we won Best Resort in the World for Amangiri in Utah. And at that time, it was the first Aman we'd opened with a wood oven and a grill, and the chef was hopeless. He was an alcoholic. We had to get rid of him. And so I put on a jacket and for the pre-opening, and I said to Sonny, look, a couple of weeks, I'll be in the kitchen, just get these guys trained up. And then we had another project then. I think we were going into South America and Argentina, and Adrian's like, okay, you need to get back on the road. And after 2 months, I'm like, and Sonny's like, you seem to be enjoying this. And I said, yeah, I think it's time again. But you have to be inspired. And I think you have to. And then it was really in every place that I'd worked and traveled, I was drawn to, people grilling corn on the side of the street in Guadalajara, or a little yakiniku place in Akasaka in Tokyo. And so it was like charcoal was the thing. It's like, okay. And then the food memories. And then it was like, right, I have an idea for Woodcut. And that didn't work out in the US. So we did Bridge Room, but Woodcut was always there. So I think, long-winded answer to your question, but I think the advice for someone who, if I can visualize. I'm very visual in terms of I can see a pathway. So I don't take on stuff that I don't see the pathway to achieve it. You have to bring people along with you to help you do that. You can't do it all yourself. So for me, the only thing I would say to people to continue to be inspired, find something else. Find something else that inspires you equally as much. Because I mean, that's worked for me. It might not work for others, but I know people who get up in the morning and go to the gym, and that's their thing. I know people who surf, who cycle, 10Ks before they go to work. So for me, it's making sculpture or drawing or painting or, those are the things that, and I think about, I problem solve constantly in my brain about work while I'm doing something else. So I don't know if it's the creative outlet helps me be more creative in problem solving or thinking of dishes and why we do it. And, I don't know another way. So I'm stuck with that system.
Well, it seems to be working for you. And Ross, as always, it's an absolute pleasure catching up with you. I know you've got so much more to tell us, so we'll have to get you back on. Please keep in touch. We'll catch up again soon.
Always good to chat, Hucks. And I do have another project, so maybe next year we'll have a chat.
Okay. This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Stay tuned as we take a deep dive into the lives of the incredible people who ply their trade in the food and hospitality sector. Special thanks to executive producer Rob Locke for making this all happen. Follow us on Instagram at Deep in the Weeds Podcast or email us at podcast@deepintheweeds.com.au. Thanks to executive producer Rob Locke for making this all happen. Stay safe and be well.